Hello, it's me, Mario. Woohoo! You watching GRTV, my favorite. Wahoo!
Let's just start off with the main theme of Cataclysm here. We have the world of Azeroth torn apart. But why did you, as a company, decide that it was time to go back to the original country, so to speak?
Well, more than anything else, what we found, even as we created the Burning Crusade and the Wrath of the Lich King, we were realizing that, wow, our content that we're making now is a lot better than our original content we were making 5 years ago, or at the time, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So as we continue to make that newer content, we realized that, you know what, we really need to improve the original game experience. We were finding more and more that people were telling their friends as their friends came into the game that, you know, just get through the first 60 levels, and then after that it gets really good. And we're like, well, that's kind of a problem. So we felt like, you know, the time had come that we really would want to go back and improve that 1 to 60 experience to bring it up to, or even surpass the quality level of the level 70 to 85 content. So I think that's what, more than anything else, we've tried to do with Cataclysm, and so far we've been happy with the results.
One of the things that was always said about flying mounts in Azeroth was the fact that if you looked beyond the veil, you could see a lot. There was a lot of, you know, broken.
Mirrors.
Exactly. How much work have that been adapting Azeroth to flying mounts?
Well, it's been a significant amount of work, although it really helped to package it with the kind of revamp of that level 1 to 60 content. We talked about doing it at first when we introduced flying mounts with Outland, because we knew right away when we introduced flying mounts that people would want to use them in the old world. And we also talked about it again in Northrend, but both times it was pretty clear that we were not going to have the time to go back and really redo all those zones the way we would have to make it work. But then when Cataclysm came around and we were already talking about improving that gameplay experience from 1 to 60, it was pretty clear that it would make sense that at the same time, hey, let's paint all the backsides of those mountains while we're at it and make this place viable so that it can finally feel complete.
One of the things that changed a lot during Wrath of the Lich King is that when I left the game and then came back, and I realized a lot has changed with the Dungeon Finder, for example.
Right.
And that's been discussed at least a lot on MMO blogs, and so that the social side of the game has, well, it's changed. I'm not going to say it's gotten worse or better, it just changed. Is that something that you will be exploring in Cataclysm?
It is. I mean, as time goes on, we're going to see more and more how the Dungeon Finder impacts the social gameplay experience, and more we're going to want to give players tools to communicate more easily with each other in ways that aren't necessarily typing out, you know, okay, you're going to go stand over here to the left, and you're going to go do this, because we realize that as these groups become more and more ad hoc and just kind of thrown together through a tool like the Dungeon Finder, it's important for players that haven't done the content before to be able to easily find out, well, what am I supposed to do in this boss fight so I don't look like an idiot or whatever? Because I think that's one of the things that players get very nervous about when they get into Dungeon Finders, that like, well, I don't want to look stupid, right? I don't want anybody to know I don't know what I'm doing, but man, I don't know what I'm doing. And we want to make it easier for the players that do know what they're doing to say, hey, just stand over here and do this, and we're all going to be okay.
You're going to improve the guild system as well. How did that come about?
Right. Well, that really came about because there was a lot of passion on the team about introducing a system where guilds would be able to get achievements and get levels, really so that the game would recognize the accomplishments of guilds, and so that guilds could feel like maybe they were a little bit different from each other and feel like they had an identity that went beyond just the name of the guild. So we really kind of ran with that idea, talked about, you know, what would it mean for guilds to have levels, what would it mean for guilds to have achievements, how would that work, and the idea just kind of kept building on itself until we finally arrived at the idea that we settled on.
You know what would be the next step for that? That would be guild halls.
Yeah, guild halls would be very cool. You know, it's something that's another feature that we've talked about all the time. It's almost like, it's like the, you know, flying in the old world, where it's like, well, we talk about our expansion and decide, you know, is this something we can do? No, not yet. So we'll talk about it again next time. So I'm sure that we'll talk about it again in the future and see how, you know, see whether that fits into our plans.
One of the things, if we look at other modern MMOs or under development MMOs such as Guild Wars 2 and Star Wars: The Old Republic, what we see is a lot of focus on story. And that's not saying that World of Warcraft doesn't have a story, of course, but it's very much, with instances and all stuff like that. Is that something that you guys have been thinking about?
Well, it certainly is. I think that with Cataclysm, we have taken measures to improve the feeling of the storyline the players engaged in as they level up, more than we ever have before. I think that the new level 1 to 60 experience will have a much more engaging storyline that players are going with from start to finish. Although, that certainly isn't as much of a point of emphasis for us as it has been for other games. And I think that has a lot of potential to be interesting in the solo game experience. It's yet to be seen how that, proves out in the multi kind of player game experience where, if you're in a group together with a bunch of other people that are on like slightly different storylines, and what happens when you do an instance and one person wants to do something one way and another person wants to do something another way. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. But it's definitely a very interesting idea. I do think that there are going to be ways that we can continue to deliver story in a more interesting, more fun kind of way. But at the same time, we do want to stay true to the core vision of World of Warcraft.
Of course, you guys being the big boy on the block, you're the biggest MMO in the world, at least in the Western world, and a lot of criticism comes with that. It always comes with the territory being popular. But one of the things that keeps coming up, and this has been coming up since vanilla World of Warcraft, is that you're making the game easier. You're making MMOs easier. You're killing. Someone said you're more or less killing adventure now, or you've been doing for a long time. How do you feel about criticism like that?
I think that a lot of the criticism is unfair. I think that while we do take measures to make the game easier to learn, we also take measures to make the game harder to master, and that's why we created things like heroic mode. And I think if you look at the content today, if you compare the encounters that we see today, even in normal mode, in our high-end raid content or even our 5-man dungeon content, and you compare those encounters to the encounters of vanilla WoW, and look at the dungeon encounters there, look at the raid encounters there, and tell me which content is more complex, more interesting, has more depth. There's absolutely no comparison. So I think that it's sort of a natural reaction for hardcore players to anytime we are trying to make something a little bit easier to learn, or we're trying to expand the audience so that more players get to raid, and it shrinks that gap between the hardcore guy who used to be 4 tiers of gear ahead of the really casual guy, that it makes them think that, oh, well, WoW's becoming too easy. But then when it doesn't really match up with when you look at the heroic Lich King encounter, and look at Blackwing from Blackwing Lair or something like that, and try to tell me that they're anywhere on the same level.
Do you never miss those days when you can make an entire raid dungeon just tank and spank?
Well, I do miss those days. That'd be really easy for us. We'd be able to jam those things out a lot quicker.
But do you think that experiment, which started more or less with, because Burning Crusade had a lot of hardcore endgame stuff. Lady Vash, you haven't lived if you haven't tried the Lady Vash encounter. But that you started to really close that gap during Wrath of the Lich King between, as you said, the hardcore and the casual. Do you think that experiment has turned out well for you?
Well, I think it has. I mean, just in terms of if you look at the number of players, and we see the number of players that are actually going into those instances, and as a percentage of the population of level 80 players versus the old days, the number of players that were doing Encourage or Naxxramas or even like Zul'Gurub, stuff like that. If you look at the percentage of players that were doing those, it was much, much lower. And so, when we look at that and say, well, at the time we were spending a lot of time creating a whole lot of content for a very small percentage of our players, it's only so long before you realize that doesn't make a whole lot of sense and that things really shouldn't go on that way. Now, that being said, we definitely want to have content that only the hardcore are able to beat, and that's why we have the heroic modes, and that's why we have these, soul-crushing encounters like, the Lich King or like Algalon was when it was, the current tier of raid content.
Do you think that's only a good thing as a world builder and MMO designers, that everybody gets to more or less see everything?
More or less, yeah. I do think there's room for tuning, what that percentage is. Maybe, I could see doing making a few more bosses exclusive to hardcore players. And I could see kind of shifting that needle a little bit. But I don't think we're way off. I think it would definitely be, I don't think it would be a good move to make it so that most players can't get into the raiding or see a lot of the content.
How do you think the PvP experiment, more hard to find a word for it, but with all the arenas and all the battlegrounds you've had, how do you feel about that now, going from Wrath to Cataclysm?
Right. Well, I think that we learn, from each time that we do it. We've learned from Wintergrasp, and we're trying to apply that to Tol Barad. I definitely think that in a lot of ways, PvP is one of the most difficult things there is to design, because you don't have as much control over what people are going to do and the way people are going to behave. At least in PvE, we have complete control over one half of it. we know what the game's going to do. We just don't have complete control over what the players are going to do to the game. And we can also ensure that one side doesn't have feelings that are going to get hurt. And that's a big part of the trick with PvP is that even in a perfectly balanced scenario, PvP is still not for everybody, because in a perfectly balanced scenario, you're still talking about losing half the time. And for some people, losing half the time just isn't fun. So I do think that there is a limit to how broad that appeal can get, and it's just a question of figuring out how we can maximize it and how we can get as many people as we reasonably can to enjoy it.
Are there any time during the development of Cataclysm that you felt like, oh my God, what have we done?
I think that, early on as we started to go through the zones and revamp the zones, there was like, oh man, this is going to be so much. Like, how are we possibly going to do all this? And then we, really just had to buckle down and figure out what was the most important stuff to change and make sure that we got the most important stuff done first, and then, finish up whatever else we can with the time that we have available.
All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.